Good afternoon, everyone. Been a long time trying to get me down here. The COVID hit, and then you guys weren't doing the talks for a while. So I think Ed and I have been in communications probably 2 years or more, but finally worked out.
Yay.
And we'll be speaking about Catoctin Mountain. And when I started researching Catoctin Mountain, it was, there's some interesting things I noticed. Number one, people didn't know whether it was Catoctin Mountain or Catoctin Mountains. And I did find it is considered one mountain. So it's just Catoctin Mountain. But it sort of incorporates a lot of little places like the Braddock Heights area. That over there is considered part of Catoctin Mountain in Frederick. So, and it runs, as you know, noted, from Leesburg up to Emmitsburg, crossing the river, which is kind of unusual, that it maintains its identity going across the Potomac. The other thing I noticed is, you have the Virginia end of the mountain, the Maryland end of the mountain up around the Thurmont, Emmitsburg area. There's a lot of similarities in the way that the culture and the history along the mountain developed. They both had iron furnaces. They both were used for Underground Railroad routes. They both had plenty of moonshining going on out there.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that parallel evolution of the history. But I want to start off with what is my favorite Catoctin Mountain story. And that is about the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. It was the forerunner of the CIA, and it was this country's first effort at unorthodox warfare. Prior to that time, the country used, they searched out tactical intelligence, like how many planes, how many ships, things like that. This got more into guerrilla warfare during World War II. And it was started by the man on the right there, William Donovan, who was a decorated World War I veteran. And at the time, he was a lawyer in New York City when President Roosevelt called him back into service for the country to develop this organization that would be able to go behind enemy lines and essentially spy on the enemies and collect intelligence in that manner. So at its peak in 1944, the OSS employed about 13,000 civilians and military. About 7,500 of them were serving overseas, and 4,500 of them were women. And of the women, 900 of them were serving overseas. So, kind of think Mata Hari, female femme fatales doing some spying for us. Over its 4-year life, the OSS spent about $135 million, which equates to more than $1 billion today, to gather enemy intelligence and disrupt their operations. So all those agents had to be trained. So, and there were various training camps. Virginia had one, and the one in Maryland was on Catoctin Mountain. So, so this was a shot taken. This used to be the entrance to Catoctin Mountain Park on April 5th, 1942. Those gates swung shut, and they stayed shut for a few more years, and they actually had armed guards at them. It was done without notice because the park had been converted to a training camp. Now, any of you who've been up to Catoctin Mountain Park now, you go up 77, has nice, easy access. Back then, the best access was coming in more from the north side of the park, from Lance, where the railroad had a drop off, and they would bring people in to that drop off point and then truck them into the park. So, and they brought these agents and these recruits in, very typical spy fashion. There was one guy I interviewed years ago, his name was Frank Gleason. He was a recruit. He eventually became a demolitions instructor at the Catoctin Park. And he talked about, they picked him up in DC with other recruits, put him in a truck, one of those trucks you see like in the World War II movies with the canvas sides. They pulled those sides around and down, tied them down, so they were in the dark. They didn't know where they were going, and they brought them up. So they had no clue how close, how far, or where they were when they finally were let out of the back of the truck. Now, the one in, as I said, Virginia had a camp as well. That one was in Prince William Forest. It taught some similar things, but they each kind of had a specialty area. And here in the Catoctin Mountain Park, it was more of the guerrilla warfare, the spying, the blowing things up, safe cracking, that kind of stuff. And for the most part, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of their agents were military. They recruited particularly first generation Americans who were in the Navy, Army, because they had, they could still pass for their European, parents and grandparents. They knew the language pretty fluidly, so they could, it was easier to blend them in behind the enemy lines. But because of what they needed them to do, they also selected people from high society who could blend in, with society in Europe. A lot of college graduates, they wanted people who had a lot of intelligence, but then they also needed people with certain skill sets. So they recruited safecrackers and forgers to, teach at the camps. So you had a very diverse mix of types of people at these camps being trained for one purpose: find out what the enemy's doing and disrupt it. The women I mentioned earlier, they looked for them, particularly ones who were fluent in French, English, and German. They were first generation, even better, because it was easier to blend them in, to get them into, to get them behind enemy lines, because the Germans, the Italians, they weren't generally suspecting the women to be spies. And so they could get in some places where the men couldn't. So they came here, they had classes in hand-to-hand combat, infiltration training, marksmanship, setting charges, safe cracking, forgery, code breaking. And they learned it all, or they learned as much as they could, in 6 to 8 weeks. That was about the average time they were there. Now, another one of the recruits that I interviewed, he told me that the first thing they had him do when his group arrived was they put them with sledgehammers next to a pile of rocks and had them breaking rocks for hours, just like the old prison movies. And he said he figured it was because they wanted to see, test their endurance, and also see if they would, mentally break because of just having to give this mindless labor. So they were already, first day in there, they're given some weird stuff to do. Now, this particular agent I just told you about, his name was Spiro Capone, Greek, first generation Greek. Now, he had been recruited at Miami University. He was in the Navy. And the man who recruited him, he knew as Captain John Hamilton. They had gone out, pulled in the Navy recruits at the university to an auditorium, asked who could speak another language, who was first generation. And, you know, the Navy seamen were raising their hands, so they were pulling them out. They'd take them behind the scenes, interview them. And one of the things Spiro said was, it confused him because when Hamilton was trying to recruit him, he told him, you know, he'd be doing some parachute. And Spiro was like, I'm a seaman. I don't, you know, I'm not in the Air Corps. I don't do parachuting, sir. Hamilton said, well, if you join for this assignment, you will be doing a lot more than that. So he agreed, and Captain Hamilton was also going with him on the same truck to Catoctin Park. And by the time they got to the park, Spiro recognized finally Captain Hamilton was actually a movie star named Sterling Hayden. Aliases were big at the camp. Everybody had an alias. They were assigned fake names. They even wore their little name tags, you know, hi, I'm Bill type of thing. But they were not allowed to, even within their group of recruits, give their real names. So they always went by these fake names. Again, compartmentalizing things. You couldn't give away someone you didn't know. Now, one of their recruits at the camp was known as an English colonel who had served with the Shanghai police. Very deadly, according to the recruits, very harsh. Again, nobody knew his name. They just knew him as Frank. So here's one of the recruiting shots. This one, I believe, was actually taken at the Virginia site. So here they're learning code breaking. One of the sites that was made popular up at Catoctin Mountain Park, but it's something that you still see today, and it came from Catoctin Mountain Park. How many of you seen like Hogan's Alley, or you know, when the police go in and things are popping up and noise and they have to decide and shoot? That was developed as a training exercise at Catoctin Mountain Park. They called it the Spook House. It was a building up on the mountain. The trainees were armed with 45 caliber pistol, 2 clips of 6 shots each. They were sent into the house, and as they're going through the house, you had these cardboard pop-ups of Germans that would swing out, pop up, and they would have to react and shoot before it was deemed that they were shot. Another thing they did, according to one of the recruits, was this one recruit named Frank Gleason, he was the one who was the demolitions instructor and recruit. He said, we trained in individual sabotage. It's what the terrorists do now. It was fascinating work. Our job was to interfere with the enemy in every way possible. And then Capone added that, he goes, because he was a small seaman. By the time he finished his training at Catoctin Park, he bulked up to 180 pounds. He was all muscle and sinew. But he said, I became a tough little guy. I learned about knife throwing, how to kill with my bare hands, how to kill with a newspaper or a comb. So they were not fooling around. And a lot of the training exercises were live fire. There was one recruit, they were supposed to be crawling along some trails to reach a particular spot. There were explosions that were being set off over them. And if they had stayed down, they would have been fine. This guy apparently got up a little too early, and one of the explosions knocked a chunk out of a tree that flew off and broke this guy's jaw. His name was William Casey. He grew up to be the director of the CIA under Reagan. He was an OSS agent. A lot of the CIA directors were actually former OSS agents. Not sure how many actually trained in Catoctin, but you know, at least Casey did. So their days training ran from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. The actual training time went from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Then they would have, you know, some stuff like this and then meal breaks, things like that. And then Gleason said, quote, when we were well trained, I could take a group of 6 people and put a major city out of action for a month. You blow up the sewers, blow up the power plants, and destroy the motors for the phones. So they, you know, they knew what they were doing, and a lot of them did just that during the war. And not only were there Americans being trained, because they were going to be sent overseas and needing to work with allies and guerrilla agents in different countries. A lot of those people were brought over to train so they could learn to interact and how to work and communicate with the OSS agents. So there were people at Catoctin Mountain trained who came from Norway, Thailand, Yugoslavia, Italy, and France. And then once they were trained, once they completed their 6 to 8 weeks, they had a final project, just like high school. They were sent into a military target somewhere nearby, and they were given a job to steal something. You know, maybe they told them they need to steal particular plans for something, or they had to do some kind of mission while in that military site. Now, they knew that they were Americans going into an American site. The Americans who were running these places did not know. So there is one story of one of these pairs of guys that were sent into the aircraft manufacturing plant in Hagerstown to steal some plans, and they were discovered. And apparently the crews at the plant nearly beat them to death. They thought they were German spies, and they went after them. And so it was, you know, if you failed, it was deadly, or it could be deadly. So the seaman getting the decoration there, that is Screw Pony, the first generation Greek guy I told you about. He was shipped out after his training to Cairo in Egypt. And of course, he actually did do parachute training as Hamilton or Sterling Hayden told him. And while he was overseas, he generally worked at the embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. However, while he was there, he got wind through his contacts in the underground of how Germany was funneling ore through the area and the supply lines where they were and what they were doing. So he put his OSS training to use, got with the underground in the area, and they set out to, in northern Greece, to blow up and disrupt those supply lines. They were out there for 9 weeks, thwarting the Germans' efforts to get ore to their plants. So he was lucky. He survived. He made it back. A lot of the agents did not. There were some of them. They were often executed as spies because they were not uniformed officers. They were not in uniform when they were captured. So they would not be sent to prisoner of war camps. They would just be executed. And there were many of them, dozens of the OSS agents did not make it through, but many of them did. Trying to think, there's an old movie, an old POW escape movie called Great Escape.
Starlight 17. Starlight 17.
No, not Starlight 17, but the Great Escape. That's what, is that World War II?
Yeah.
That is roughly, that is inspired by a true story of an OSS agent. One that they did actually try to keep in a prisoner of war camp, and they could not do it. He kept trying to escape and was eventually successful. And that movie is roughly based on his story. I learned that last year. Now, here's a clip that was taken from a propaganda video that was made by none other than John Ford. You all know who John Ford is? 5-time Academy Award-winning director. And he actually went up to Catoctin Mountain and shot footage of their training. So that's why you see, these are actual agents. That's why they're wearing the Lone Ranger masks, so that they could not be identified. So when you watch the video, it's actually kind of comical. You got dozens of people and they're all running around in the Lone Ranger masks in Army uniforms. But that was to protect their identities because they're real agents. This is a shot taken where the instructor is showing some pressure points for hand-to-hand combat. But you can still see that clips from that video or that movie. Catoctin Mountain Park website has it, and you can find them on YouTube as well. It's like 4 or 5 parts on YouTube. But it kind of describes how their training goes. Now, when I originally started, when I heard about the OSS camp there, that was not widely available. Former Park Superintendent Mel Poole was the one who mentioned it to me that the OSS had been training there during World War II. And he had stumbled onto this video at the Spy Museum in DC. And he told me exactly where to go to see it, because that was the only place you could see it at the time. And I'm assuming they still have it there. You can see it next to James Bond's Aston Martin. So you can take your eyes off that nice car. To the right, they have the video playing on a loop over there. And it's interesting to watch, to see some of the stuff they were teaching them. I mean, these guys, they're teaching them like how to conceal little derringers, or like this expanding lead slug on a length of tubing, so that, you know, it starts out about that big, but, you know, they flick it and the lead slug pulls it out about that big, and then, you know, so it becomes a defensive weapon. Teaching these Army guys how to fight like that, and, you know, so they're learning how to fight dirty as well as, you know, how to do all the other stuff. So interesting. There's you know, so much up there, and unfortunately, I'm not sure how much has been declassified. I mean, some has started to be declassified in the past 20 years, which is how things are starting to trickle out. There was a Rutgers University professor that I talked with. He was trying to research the history of the OSS at the park. He's the one who got me in contact with a lot of the former agents who had been training there. But you know, they didn't know. It was hard to find some of these people, you know, because they all went by aliases. So if they chose not to reveal their names, it was hard to figure out who actually trained up there. Now I want to tell you about the story of Bessie Darling, a murder that took place on the mountain. And it's a murder that has continued. I mean, it's not a mass murder. It's not a spectacular murder, but it's something that continues to hold the public's attention even today. There was a musical written about this murder. So on Halloween Day, 1933, a 62-year-old employee of the Maryland Department of Health named George Schultz got off the train at Thurmont, hired a taxi to take him up to the Valley View Hotel, which was on Catoctin Mountain. That is the Valley View Hotel. So more of a B&B than a hotel that you would typically think of. As he was getting into the taxi driver noticed the guy was armed at a sideline and made a comment about it. Schultz tried to laugh it off. He said, quote, he didn't know what he might run into. But he goes up there and he's looking for Bessie Darling. She owns the place. She had owned it since 1917 when she was divorced. She bought it from another woman. And what she would do is she lived in Baltimore, kind of a Baltimore socialite. So she used her contacts that she would make during the winters in Baltimore among her social circles to essentially drum up business to get the summer crowds that were coming out to Catoctin Mountain to enjoy the cool air. This particular location was not too far from Penmar, which is on South Mountain in Washington County, big resort area in the early part of the 20th century. So a lot of people would come out to stay in those hotels, use the lakes, the other resort things that they had, the miniature train, things like that up there. So she got a lot of summer guests, and that's how she made her living after she got divorced. Now she knew Schultz. They were friends. They'd been friends since 1926. They were, close enough that occasionally Schultz even spent Christmases with Bessie and her family. Now, Bessie was 48 in 1933, so she was 14 years his junior. So he comes up to, he has the cab drop him off at the house. It's early in the morning, 7 a.m. And he comes in the back way. Now, even though he was very good friends with her, he saw more in their relationship. He thought they were more romantically involved, although apparently that was never the case. And he was a very jealous sort of guy. Most recently, he had thought Bessie was starting to date a 63-year-old farmer that lived on the mountain, which apparently the farmer said afterwards was never the case, that he barely knew her, but something George had seen had triggered him, and so he was in a rage. And the week before, he'd been up in this rage, got a little violent with her. So she actually wound up leaving the hotel until he left and went back to Baltimore. And then she decided she wasn't going to go back to Baltimore because she didn't want to have to deal with it. So she was going to stay there through the winter. He must have realized it and came up at the end of the month. So he comes up, he's at the back end of the house, knocks on the door, the maid answers, this young 18-year-old girl named Maisie Williams, and he barges right past her, insisting he has to see Bessie. He starts charging through the house. Maisie's running ahead of him, trying to get to Bessie's room so she can warn him this guy's coming. She gets to the room, gets in the room, closes and locks the door to the room behind her, and then starting to tell Bessie what's going on. George knocks the door open and pulls his gun, shoots Bessie dead. She falls right to the floor. Maisie is screaming, and George just calmly sits down on the bed and tells her to go make him some coffee. So she leaves. She, of course, does not make him coffee. She runs to the nearest house she can find that has a phone and calls for the police. When the police, the county deputies arrive, they find the back door still open. In fact, it's the only thing that George has locked all the windows other doors to the house. It's only the back door that's now open. So they come in very cautious. They go up to the room and they find Bessie dead on the floor, as Maisie had told them. But they also find that George has shot himself. And he's on the floor as well. So, but he's not dead. They get him to the hospital and he recovers. So a shot of Bessie's gravestone in Vermont. So he obviously was tried for murder. In 1934, it went to trial. There were 26 witnesses, and the jury deliberated only an hour before they found him guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder. He tried to claim that Bessie had attacked him and that she had a gun as well, and that he had acted in self-defense. So they didn't totally buy it, but it must have created enough doubt that they downgraded it to second degree. But he served 18 years in the Maryland State Penitentiary for murder. And as I said, it's a case that continues to pop up in the papers every couple of years. There's a musical written about it. Really, that the hotel is gone now. All that's there are the foundations. So the only tangible evidence nowadays is the grave marker.
Where is that?
That is one of the cemeteries in Thurmont, and I'm forgetting which one now. It looks like it may not be the original, because that looks like it's a fairly new one.
What was the musical?
It was called Bessie Darling.
Oh. Cool.
I just can't picture it. I didn't go see it, but I'm just trying to picture this George singing as he shoots her, and Daisy screaming and singing as she runs off. So you guys had moonshining down here, but not on the scale of the Blue Blazes still, which is, that is mass production of moonshine. And during Prohibition, Catoctin Mountain moonshine actually had a very good reputation. I guess the moonshiners took pride in their product along the mountain. There was an interview I saw of a salesman. He was interviewed in the 70s as part of like an oral history project, and he talked about part of his route was up in New York City, and these New Yorkers would find out he was from the Catoctin Mountain area. As soon as he mentioned Catoctin, they knew him because they knew where he was from, because they knew of Catoctin Mountain moonshine. It was known for good quality up there. So. Now the Blue Blaze is still operation, and the newspapers only called it one of the largest operations in Frederick County. I have yet to find one that was larger, because at any given time, it had about 25,000 gallons of moonshine. It was producing that much, which that much at the time would have been close to $600,000 street value. Back then, a pint during Prohibition, a pint of whiskey, moonshine whiskey, would go for about $16. So it was a very profitable business and well worth defending, which is what they did. So in 1929, the Frederick County Sheriff's Department got word of this giant operation up on Catoctin Mountain. They were, they enforced the law, but they weren't anal about it. If it was somebody just running a little 20-gallon still for personal and family use, they often did not go after those small-time operators. But this one was just too big. They could not ignore it. So on July 31st, 1929, a group of deputies and their informant made their way up Catoctin Mountain on a dirt road. They were going slow, trying not to raise dust to give away that they were coming. The informant had the two vehicles pull over at this one location. And then the informant and the deputy, John Hem, went back. They started walking back. The informant's name was Lester Hoffman. He's leading them back to where he said the operation was. And they go a little bit. They come upon a guy sitting on a rock with a shotgun. So the guy pretty much just warns them off, tells them that they better get away if they want to be safe and not get in trouble. So Hem and the deputies are, they're not dressed in uniform. They're essentially undercover for this operation. So Hem and Hoffman, they turned to go back. They saw what they needed. They know that, yes, the operation is there, probably active at the moment since it's being guarded. So they go back, they gather up the other 4 deputies that were with them. And then the whole group just heads off back the way they came, loaded with weapons and axes to break the mash vats, things like that. Among them is Deputy Sheriff Clyde Hopper. So by the time they get to the rock, that guard's gone. So he must have realized what was happening too. He's gone back to warn the people at the still. So they continue on. They charge into the clearing. These 5 deputies and the informant. They start exchanging gunfire with the moonshiners. Now there's only, turns out only 2 of the moonshiners actually had weapons. The rest of them, they're holding the deputies off while everybody else is, running for the thicket and the woods and little trails and gullies trying to get away. As the deputies start to run across the clearing to chase after them, they do notice Clyde Hopper falls, but they think he's just tripped over a tree root. They keep going, trying to chase these moonshiners down. Of course, the moonshiners get away. They come back and they realize Clyde is still on the ground and that he's been shot. So they call for an ambulance and the doctor from Thurmont and load him onto, once the ambulance finally comes, and it's not a very quick journey because they had to get to a phone, call for the ambulance. The ambulance has to come up what is not, a nice paved Interstate 15 anymore, and Maryland 77. It's dirt roads and gravel and things like that. But they get there, and on their way back to the hospital, things are looking so bad for Clyde that a Maryland State Trooper who's in the ambulance with him, his name's John Taylor, actually volunteers to give Clyde a blood transfusion while they're driving. But it doesn't do any good. By the time they get to the hospital, they can't detect a heartbeat, and he's pretty much bled out. So while Clyde was being taken to the hospital, the deputies and other law enforcement who are still there, they take access to this operation. Each of these vats are 500 gallons. There are 20 of them at the site. The operation has a boiler from a steam locomotive that they're using to heat things up. So it is large scale, and they go to town destroying everything. Then the actually, to give you an idea also of how quickly this thing could make moonshine, generally with a still, it kind of drips out of the condenser coil at the end. Well, Deborah Mills, who was a ranger up at the park, I heard her talk once. She said that still operation could make moonshine so fast that it was said that if you took away a 5-gallon bucket to go take it and fill up some bottles and things, by the time you came back with an empty bucket, there was already another 5-gallon bucket filled up. So it
Wow.
must have been a pretty steady flow coming out of the coils. So after they destroy this, then the manhunt begins for the moonshiners. They eventually capture 8 moonshiners, but they only charge 2 of them in the murder of Clyde Hauver. Their names are, their last names are Lewis and Clark. It's hard to forget. Charles Lewis and Lester Clark. They were actually put on trial for murder in Washington County the following year. Now, before that even happened, there were rumors going out. One of the rumors was that Hauver was not the intended victim of the bullet, that it had been another deputy named Deputy Redmond, although I've not heard why he was supposedly the target. Another rumor was that Clyde Hauver was indeed the target because one of the other deputies was having an affair with his wife and wanted to get him out of the way. And to support that, you know, it hadn't been the moonshiners was the fact that Clyde had been shot in the back of the head. And the caliber of bullet did not match the weapons that the moonshiners had. But they put them on trial and they were found, Lewis and Clark were found guilty and sentenced to prison on March 6, 1930. Now, Clark was sentenced to 15 years and Lewis, who was the one they thought actually pulled the trigger, got a life sentence. But that was commuted in 1951 because of his poor health. He was 65 years old. He was released and died 2 years later. So meanwhile, since then, Deputy Hauver's name has been added to the National Law Enforcement's Officer Down Memorial in DC, and he's the only Frederick County deputy to be killed in the line of duty. Here's another shot of the Blue Blazes. This looks like it's probably the steam locomotive boiler back here.
A lot of women there. Women.
Yeah, you know, well, they drink too. You know, they probably brought their husbands lunches and took them a little bit extra. Now, there is a very humorous story about the Blue Blazes still. And that has to do with, even though moonshining is generally thought of as illegal, there was one place and one time that it was totally legal. And that was in Catoctin Mountain Park from 1970 to 1989, when the National Park Service ran a still for demonstration purposes. And now here's a shot of the Blue Blazes still. So when the Park Service started doing these demonstrations of the Blue Blazes still, here's the still that they were showing me. That is a 50-gallon still, as opposed to 20 times 500, so a 10,000 gallon still operation. This was actually captured during a raid in Tennessee when the Park Service went to try and assemble it to use for the demonstration purposes. They went to talk to all these old moonshiners down in Tennessee who, you know, they bragged about being moonshiners. But when the Park Service shows up asking them, well, how do we put this still together? They were all like, what are you talking about? I don't know. I don't do stuff like that. They actually found the assembly instructions for still in a high school newspaper in Tennessee. So yeah, it was very well known how to do it down there. Now, when they got it all together in 1970 and start things up, the first day of operation, they get raided by the Maryland state government. The Park Service had, gone through the proper channels to get the permission from the federal government to make moonshine. They hadn't gone through the Maryland state government. And Maryland, of course, wanted their share. So Frank Menser, who was a longtime superintendent of the park, was quoted in the newspaper. He says, "I'm still known as the only park superintendent in the service who's been rated for being a moonshiner." That slide turned out weird. So Catoctin Mountain's big claim to fame, of course, is Camp David, where the president likes to relax. The first president who's known to have come up there was actually Herbert Hoover. He came up because he liked to fish. He didn't stay there in any formal way, but he would come up and do fly fishing in the rivers up there. Then during the Great Depression, the federal government came in with one of their alphabet groups and decided they needed to take over the area because a lot of the farms were failing because of poor soil. Had been drained of nutrients from inefficient farming practices. And the Catoctin furnace had pretty much denuded the mountain of trees in the area. So they came in using good forestry practices, good farming practices, teaching the farmers how to grow better things and get more from the land again. They planted trees again. So it started coming back, and it was known as the Catoctin Recreation Demonstration Area. As it started to regain some of its glory, they started building winter or summer cabins for campers who were starting to come back. Even as World War II started, but before the U.S. had gotten involved, it was being used as a recreation area of sorts for British soldiers who just needed time off away from the war. They would be sent to here for some R&R, and they would stay in the summer cabins. So around that time, the president, Roosevelt, he decided he just needed to have a getaway as well. He could not go to Hyde Park because the Secret Service did not want him traveling by rail because of the danger of something happening. So they said, okay, well, we need you to stay within 2 hours of DC by car. So they started looking at sites, and Roosevelt's doctor also put the condition on that it should be above 2,000 feet for the fresh air and things like that. And this, they settled on the Catoctin Recreation Demonstration Area. And they set off a section of it for presidential compound. And Roosevelt initially named it Shangri-La. It was named Camp David under President Eisenhower, named after his son. Now, this is a neat shot of Churchill and Roosevelt fishing, but you may not know, at one point, early 20th century, Frederick County, Maryland, was responsible for 90% of the goldfish in this country. It was big business over there. Any farmer that had a pond was raising goldfish. And really nowadays you've got, there's only 2 that really still around, lily ponds and Hunting Creek fisheries. But I knew a guy whose dad was one of these goldfish farmers. And he told me a story in 1942. Well, they used to harvest goldfish from their ponds, take it to a little storefront they had on the old Frederick Road, which became 15. And they'd be there on the weekends. They put the fish in the ponds, so people going back and forth on the road could stop and buy goldfish if they wanted. And they had a nice, very ornate sign in the shape of a goldfish, painted yellow and all. So one day in 1942, they're at the weekend store, 3 black cars pull off the road and stop in front of the store. And Ernie was the guy, his dad was Frederick Trussell. And Frederick came to the store to see, the front door to look out, see who pulled up. And he sees this military guy walking towards him. He recognizes him as George Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff. So, and if you all heard of the Marshall Plan, that's the guy who came up with it. So Marshall comes over to Frederick. He says, the president and Mr. Churchill are interested in your operation here. I'd like to talk to you about it. So of course, Frederick was very excited. So the door opened and Churchill got out. Roosevelt did not get out. Of course, he could not walk. He didn't want to get in a wheelchair, but he kind of moved over to the side, swung his legs over to the side, just sat there in the car. Roosevelt, it turns out, was a very big goldfish man, had a lot of goldfish in England. So he and Frederick start talking shop about, they start swapping fish stories. Churchill looks at the goldfish in the pond, and they had some big goldfish too. And so he's like, oh, that's pretty good. But he goes, I have bigger ones back in my ponds in London. And then Frederick's like, well, I have bigger ones back on my farm here too. So, all the fisherman type stories. My fishing system. And so they talked for a while. And when they finished, Churchill got back in and Marshall came back over and said, well, you can't tell anybody that they were here because Shangri-La was still supposed to be a top secret place, but everybody up that end of the county knew about it. And Ernie said, thing was, there were like 100 people standing around watching Churchill and Roosevelt at the store anyway. I mean, it was no longer a secret. Ernie said but his dad made the promise, he didn't tell anyone. So he went home, he didn't tell his family about what had happened. Ernie went to school the next Monday. Everybody's talking about how his dad met Churchill and Roosevelt. He didn't know anything about it. He was coming back. So, but so back then, the president and all, they had a lot closer connection to the people than they do now. There's another shot of just some of the couple pictures from up at Camp David. Outside shot of one of the lodges up there. Now this reminds me, there's have you heard of Site R up on Raven Rock, the underground Pentagon? It's called Site R. It was the underground Pentagon for decades. It was where they would be able to evacuate and operate the government from.
Not Mount Weather?
Mount Weather.
Mount Weather?
No, but there is one down that way. Another similar type of site. This one's up just below the PA line. And but the funny thing was it's pretty much non-operational now. By the early 70s, they discovered that it wasn't deep enough to withstand the newer bombs. So it lasted for about 20 years as the underground Pentagon. But there's a mock site you can find online talking about, hey, you can spend the night in Site R. It's a big underground complex of buildings. And they supposedly have these cameras that you can see what's going on down there still and things. And they talk about how there is a hidden tunnel supposedly that went from Site R to Camp David.
Wow.
And I think they actually use this map and just add some more to it to make it, to kind of show you where the underground tunnel is. But it just reminded me of that when I saw that. let's see. Keep going.
When you said Raven Rock, that's near West Virginia.
No,
Don't you cross over?
Different Raven.
Raven Rock
Another
is,
Raven Rock.
Raven Rock is very close to Penmar.
Oh.
in that area.
Different Raven Rock.
Yeah, if you go from Emmitsburg along, what is 16 in
Oh,
Pennsylvania,
okay.
up over Blue Ridge Summit. Before you get to Blue Ridge Summit, as you start to go up that mountain, you'll actually see the razor fence behind the houses that line 16.
Sorry.
Going. These are slides from something else. I'm just not sure why I put them in there. Well, I'm sure now I got the wrong slides on here. I must have downloaded the wrong version. But I did want to tell you there is back in the early 1900s, man had not mastered flying yet. And there was a gentleman named Charles Zimmerman that did Braddock Heights. He was fascinated. He was contemporary of the Wright brothers. He'd been in communication with them at times. They were all trying to find ways to fly. He was originally born in Charlestown and moved to, once he became a doctor, he was in New York City for a while, gave that practice up to move back to Frederick. And that's when he really got into trying to develop a flying machine. And you can find advertisements in the old Frederick papers where some of his early experiments, his early models in flying machines, he was selling them for like 10 cents, which is equivalent to about $5. So you could have these early, his test models of things that he was trying to figure out. And he eventually came up with something that kind of was a weird looking contraption that had two giant 35-foot wings. And essentially the pilot would be strapped in between these wings. He had like a bicycling sort of device in that he would pedal to propel the thing forward. But you know, and they had some test pictures in one of the older papers. They said he was off the ground. It's kind of hard to tell in the picture in the paper, but it was very, very unwieldy sort of contraption. But he was among many people back then. They were trying to compete for a prize at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. It was a $100,000 prize, which is about $5 million today. To win it, you had to have a flying machine that could navigate a planned course of 15 miles that the fair directors had laid out. So everybody was trying for it, including Zimmerman. But he was, you know, he just could not make his plans work. And he pretty much had given up. And then the year before the fair was when the Wright brothers finally got into the air and made powered flight possible. That excited him again. So he got back into it. Of course, he was, you know, he still could not make his design work, but he was doing his best. He did not make it for the 1904 World's Fair. He actually said he didn't think anybody would be able to meet the criteria, and he was right. Nobody did. He claimed the prize. The closest was a guy from named Roy Canavish, who piloted something called the California Aero, which was a predecessor to a dirigible. And in fact, Roy is considered the first dirigible pilot in the country. But even he could not make his design work. Now he died, Zimmerman died of tuberculosis in 1908. And he was only 56, but he left behind 4 children. 2 of his sons took up his passion. They wanted to continue their father's work and see if they could develop his plan. And so they continued working on designs, and they came up with their own design, but based on their father's plans. Now, the catch was to achieve airborne, they had to be able to get up to 20 miles an hour, which was not so easy back then. Nowadays, I have an e-bike, it'll go 20 miles an hour. Back then, it was hard to do. So what they discovered, they went up to Middletown, where National Road passes over Catoctin Mountain. So they got at the peak of the road with their flying contraption. They put this young boy in it, because he only weighed 110 pounds. And they strapped him into the seat. They had these wings. They sent him down the hill. And of course, they got there 20 miles an hour, and they did actually, the contraption did go airborne, stayed up for about 25 feet. But the nice thing is it was repeatable. They, a few hours later, they put a guy named Robert McCutcheon in the cockpit and repeated the same experiment and got similar results, which is always good when you're doing scientific experiments. But they still, it still wasn't the most efficient device, and nothing more ever really came of it. But, Catoctin Mountain had one of those early pioneers of aviation playing on it.
Where is Braddock Heights? Where is Braddock Heights?
Braddock Heights is just outside of Frederick, as you start to go up to along 40.
Yeah, so west of 15.
Between Frederick and Middletown, along 40. So,
Okay, okay.
yeah, west of 15. It would be west of 15. So one final story I want to tell you is, since I did bring up Braddock Heights, anybody heard of the gold mine that used to be on Catoctin Mountain? Anybody? You heard it? Actually, the remnant of it is still, you got Gold Mine Road in Frederick County. They used to have a gold mining operation there. During the Great Depression, a man named Harry Baumgartner was the one who discovered it. He'd been doing some prospecting in Virginia, looking for gold, and he started, he made this connection of the soil between Virginia and Frederick County. Soil that he believed held gold in Virginia was very similar to that in Frederick County. Why he decided to come try it in Frederick County, that other than continuing to do it in Virginia, I don't know. But he came up and he sent some samples that he drew to the chemist in Baltimore, and the samples came back that they had 0.22 ounces of gold per ton. Not much. Gold back then was trading at about $35 an ounce. So, he might get about $7.70 from a ton of soil. But it also had apparently 0.38 ounces of silver per ton. So he thought that was a little extra added on bonus. He started setting up a mining operation. He contracted for 70 acres in the area that he wanted to mine. He had to agree, besides the lease, he had to agree to give the owners of the land 10% of the gold that he took out. And I guess he wasn't much of a prospector, but he was a good salesman because he got people to invest in this gold mine. During the Depression, he got it was about $60,000 in capital to start with. So he must have been a great salesman. So they were able to get the operation going. It was never a profitable operation. I mean, they did get gold, but Maryland is just doesn't have the terrain for it. Let's see, during the The state's peak production year was in the mid-40s, and during that year, only 1,000 ounces of gold throughout Maryland was mined. So Maryland is not a gold state. And you know, that mine there, not even as productive as some of the other mines. But it did stay in operation for about a decade before he finally went bankrupt. It was called the Clifton Gold Mine. And, as I said, there's still Gold Mine Road. That is pretty much the only remnant that is left of that mine back there. But you know, if you want to take a shovel back there one day and sample, see what you find, you might be lucky to find it out there too, which would be kind of fun. Well, that is all I have. Is there any questions anybody has?
Before we do that, I would like to ask us to pass our little wicker ball around, and we would like to make a contribution towards that. We really appreciate you emptying your pocketbook, check for stocks.
I like that word, empty.
Tractor collections.
Waste here.
Why don't you do a bus trip up to the gold mine place? Take your historical society up there.
There's the,
Just do like
your
your
camp.
camera.
They now have exhibits of it for here at 17. We don't heard stories about that.
Yeah, around Great Falls. They have this is one of the more productive ones around, actually. But still, it's just not, we just get a lot of gold back.
Thank you for your generosity, and we're going to turn things back to you so you can ask questions of Rana, our speaker.
My question is, I have two questions. One is, do you have any stories about Catoctin in Loudoun County? And the second one is, do you have any stories about the Native Americans from this? Catoctin?
I have some stories that they're in the Secrets of Catoctin Mountain book, but they're not like big stories like
Yeah.
the ones I was telling.
Yeah.
I mean, I have some moonshining stories, some of the Underground Railroad stories. I have the furnace story. I have the story about when they were trying to make a Catoctin County down here. Because that's another similarity between North and South. They were trying to make a Catoctin County in the 1800s up at the north end of the Catoctin.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Because we had that in the 2000s.
yeah.
right?
So that story's in there as well. Now, as far as Native Americans, there are a couple Native American stories in there. The one in there that is, there's about like a raid that the Indians had done on one of the early families up that end. But not a ton of it. I mean, I do talk about how the various names that the road and the mountain have had, you know, and a lot of them are based on Indian stories as well.
Were there any skirmishes during the Civil War on Catoctin Mountain?
They were like in the foothills. Brunswick has a great one they call the Great Calico Raid, where the Confederates came in and were raiding the canal boats and stealing the whatever they were carrying. They had something other than coal, and apparently one of them had fabric. So they were talking about how the Confederates were running around carrying bolts of calico cloth, you know, take back to their women, and so that they could have nice new dresses and things. There's an interesting story, particularly up in Emmitsburg, right before the Battle of Gettysburg. Union Army came in, they occupied Emmitsburg they took over the St. Joseph's College, which is now the National Fire Academy. There's a story the sisters tell because they were being asked to feed these soldiers, and they only had enough flour to feed the students and the sisters in this college. And they start baking bread one morning, and as the loaves come out, they're passing them out. By the end of the day, they realized that they had fed everybody, and they realized they didn't have enough flour to make that many loaves. But, you know, like one of those biblical type stories that just lasted a lot longer than it should have. And then there's, you know, of course, you had the skirmishes, Battle of South Mountain. Well, before they came to South Mountain, they were, you know, coming over Catoctin Mountain. And so there were some skirmishes there. And then little things along the foothills and all, but the major things, you know, would have been the ones I mentioned.
The write-up said you were gonna tell us stories about Snaggle-gaster, Snallygaster and other critters that I assume hidden caves on the county.
Okay, I can tell you about the Snallygaster. He's a great one. He's a mythical creature that probably this area's most famous mythical creature. In 1909, the Middletown Daily Register, Middletown Register wrote a story, complete with a picture, but it was more like a painting. A story about this creature that had swooped down and had picked up this guy, drained him of his blood, just dropped the carcass off to the side. Started a panic, which quickly spread throughout the county, into Virginia, Washington County, and suddenly people were seeing this creature. Now, interestingly enough, in that same issue, there was a guy from Ohio who was originally a native of Middletown who wrote in saying that this creature was a Snallygaster. So, you know, interesting that the timing worked out like that. But so that's how it got its name, and people started seeing this Snallygaster all over, accused of taking livestock off the road. And it was described as looking dragon-like, very serpentine sort of, but had wings, large wings, claws that were apparently retractable, a spiked tail, some people said. So it's like a typical sort of dragon that you can kind of imagine. But people were, it was just mass hysteria. There was one guy who said he had captured the Snallygaster and it was in his basement. It turned out what he had captured was a wounded giant Canadian owl, which has a very, very big wingspan and all, but is definitely not a dragon-like creature. So these sightings and all continued. There were stories about the Smithsonian was sending a group out to try and study it. Teddy Roosevelt was said to want to have hunted it. So they, you know, but no one could get anything definitive. And then as it started to spread out in Cumberland, there was a story that came out that it was like the reincarnated soul of a Civil War soldier. That the newspaper ran a story about somebody running into it out there, and it actually could speak. And it said it was this soldier died at the Battle of Chickamauga. Why it was up here, don't know. But it also claimed to be very thirsty at the time too. Then it was seen up at Emmitsburg. And up at Emmitsburg, it was said to like swoop down and grab a guy from the ground, and it was starting to fly off with him, and he would have been certainly killed if his suspenders hadn't broken and he fell back to the ground. So the mob tried to surround the Snallygaster up there, apparently, and now they said the Snallygaster was breathing fire, which is how it kept the people away. So yeah, the stories just kept building and growing. Now that was the one in Emmitsburg was the last sighting for years until the 1930s. People started seeing the Snallygaster. One of the sightings in 1909 had talked about a nest of Snallygaster eggs being found in Williamsport. How they knew it was Snallygaster eggs, I don't know. But so when it started popping up again in 1932, one of the theories was that one of those eggs had hatched, and this was a new snallygaster flying around. But the thing I like about the second version, or the second set of stories, was how this snallygaster died. And this you can find in the Hagerstown Mail. Apparently it was flying over some wooded area that hid a still in the woods. And the fumes from the still apparently overcame this flying snallygaster, and he passed out and fell into the mash vat, which was so caustic that it apparently, took all the flesh off his bones. And it just happened to happen at the same time as the Washington County Sheriff and a revenue agent were raiding that still. And they would not, they did not want to preserve the bones. They were there to destroy that still. So they destroyed the still and apparently the bones with the snallygaster as well. That's a fun story. I love the snallygaster. Now there is another creature that has been seen up on Catoctin Mountain. Doesn't have as many stories associated with it, called the Dwayyo. And this one was seen in the 60s. It was essentially a werewolf story. People have seen this wolf creature on two legs, like crossing the road up there on 77, things like that. And so the Frederick News Post had stories about this and trying to hunt it down. There were hunting parties out there. They were not letting kids go hunting that season because they were afraid they'd run into this creature. No one caught that one either, but not as fun as a snallygaster. Just the name snallygaster makes you smile. But yeah, so there are fun monsters up there. Yes.
I'm not good at geography, so if Lovettsville is here, where in relation to Lovettsville is South Mountain and Catoctin Mountain?
Kind of falls between the ends of them, doesn't it? Well, Catoctin Mountain does cross. South Mountain does not cross the river.
It's Short Hill. So if we
Is that
look
what
at-
South Mountain becomes over the
Not
river?
South Mountain, but we don't call it that. We call it Short Hill. But on the other side of the river, Short Hill becomes South Mountain,
So where is Short Hill?
out the window.
West.
That's the ridge you see out the window.
South Mountain and Catoctin Mountain run parallel in Maryland, and it's pretty much the dividing line between Washington County and Frederick County. So, pretty much that valley is where or maybe it falls, I think maybe it actually falls on South Mountain. But those two mountains run parallel and they represent the border between the two counties.
So you said Leesburg is in?
Well, because Catoctin Mountain does keep its name when it crosses the river, it does continue down in Virginia to Leesburg. Apparently South Mountain, when it crosses the river, changes name to Short Hill and continues.
Yeah, the geologists who studied the mountains, it's exactly the same geology on Short Hill as it is on South Mountain. Exactly. the
But they
same.
don't want to rename it. Huh?
No, and what happened is when the Appalachian Trail came down, they couldn't cross the river there because Short Hill Mountain, as one geologist said, it plunges into the earth,
Right.
disappears. So that's why they had to go down to Harper's Ferry and go up on the next hump, next hill.
I mean, it makes sense that it's the same since Catoctin Mountain's the same as well.
Same.
How can a mountain cross a river?
That's what makes me curious about Catoctin Mountain. It just, but the way it is, essentially that section of the mountain is low enough over the years as geology shifts. That section's gone low enough that the river,
So the foundation is there, just not a.
yeah, I mean, that mountain runs deep, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, have you ever gone to, Sidling Hill Gap? I mean, you can see where there used to be ancient oceans up there, that gap there.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd like to see that. What was the name again?
Do we have?
Sidling Hill.
Sidling Hill.
Sidling Hill, if you go, at Hancock, if you take 68 west,
Uh-huh.
right before it crosses over into Allegheny County, you'll go through, I mean, you'll know you're in it. It's just, they blasted this cut through a mountain in the 80s. And they discovered that, instead of rock formations going like this, which you would expect, they go like this in that mountain.
It's been an excellent afternoon here. We appreciate Jim coming.
Yes.
Down from Pittsburgh to speak with us and share with us about the Catoctins. We'll have a lot more to explore in coming lectures and symposiums, trips, and mini courses. Look for your newsletter. If you've signed on there, we will get you that newsletter. If you're not getting it, do let us know, because we'd love for you to get it. It's your articles about history of this region as well as upcoming events. So let's give a hand to Jim.
Yes.